Hello everyone, this is Apostate. I've been experiencing a bit of a creative block lately, and I think it's partly caused by bottled up emotions and thoughts. So this is my attempt at clearing my head. I'd like to share my thoughts on some of the struggles that a Kafir, or specifically an ex-Muslim, goes through during and after their apostasy. This will resonate with you as an ex-Muslim, obviously, and if you're an empathetic Muslim, you might find this insightful too. If you're here to fight for Islam or whatever it may be, I was going to say you don't need to be here, but I guess it wouldn't hurt for you to listen anyway. Just remember that this is our space. If you're a complete outsider, I appreciate you taking an interest in this topic, hopefully with the intention to support us apostates. Today's video is more of an audio podcast, so I hope the algorithm doesn't bury it. This will be easy to listen to while you multitask, and I will still make more visually appealing videos in the future. Don't forget to interact with this video, it really helps. Anyhow, back to the topic. There are two overarching themes here. The struggle itself and how it's exacerbated or made worse by the religion and its followers. The struggles that we go through involve existential crises, self-doubt from indoctrination, like the fear of hell for example, isolation, fitting in, feeling unnoticed, frustration, and other things of that nature. Let's begin by defining the word kafir, because it is very important to understand its roots. It is derived from the word kufr, which means covering up or hiding. Simply put, the word kafir means one who hides something, in this case one who hides the truth or denies it. A kafir knows that Islam is the truth but chooses to disbelieve anyway for some reason or another. Believers will give a laundry list of reasons but not acknowledge their own. They're hijacking the narrative in a sense. The word kafir as well as murtad are used in a derogatory way, often said in a harsh or dismissive tone. This is why my name is Apostate or Murtad. Let's take back the words. So why are the struggles of ex-Muslims on my mind? Well, some of this is inspired by my own experiences, but a lot of it I've witnessed and have been told many times, especially given my position as Alauddin. I've heard and read a lot of stories, and I feel somewhat responsible for relaying them or representing them, because we don't get enough visibility as a minority within such a controversial group, and if anything, we feel silenced as the struggles we face are weaponized by many believers against us. Here's the first example of such a struggle. A lot of us feel depression, confusion, or many other negative emotions. We feel that way after realizing that we cannot believe in Islam anymore, or defend it, or hold it dear to our hearts. There isn't enough to substantiate our faith. Our whole reality was a lie. This is a paradigm shift, a change in how we view the world. In other words, it's an existential crisis. Of course, it can be very unsettling on its own, but believers are often quick to capitalize on that because they see this struggle as some sort of proof that we do know that Islam is the truth, but we don't want to admit it. It's gaslighting and trying to convince us that we're not even in touch with our own thoughts, that they know what we think and believe deep inside, and that we're in denial, like a kafir. This is why I suspect that I'll always dislike Islam. It is built on a very insidious and harmful foundation, the sentiment that informed disbelievers are essentially evil or insane. What kind of sane person would knowingly walk themselves into hell, right? How am I supposed to not take offense to a religion built on labeling me and others like me as dishonest, hateful, or insane? And how could I believe that Islam is the truth when Allah Himself doesn't seem to notice this oxymoron, the believing disbeliever? This accusation could get inside the head of someone stuck in a situation where they can't get away from the source. It could be their parents, or everyone at their school, or everyone in the community. I have the luxury of turning off my phone and walking away from the toxicity, but they may be young and dependent, or cut off from other ex-Muslims, or impressionable, and they'd eventually think that something is wrong with them. I touch on this topic in another video, how shaitan causes extremism. You will hear believers say, this depression is evidence that you lost the inner peace that Islam gave you, as if they're scoring points for Islam somehow. And by the way, this is not an attempt to slander Muslims. This is relaying the factual reality we live in, and it's not the time or place for someone to say, not all believers. These sentiments are the mainstream in most Muslim families, communities, and countries. If you're one of the more tolerant ones, then good for you and thank you. If you've never experienced this lack of empathy, then perhaps you're lucky or you're not an ex-Muslim, so you don't get that treatment. Now let me give you an analogy to explain why we feel this sadness and why it's not at all an indication of Islam's truthfulness. Imagine finding out one day that your father is not actually your father. That'll be shocking and it will jolt you. Now on top of that, imagine finding out that he beats your mother sometimes and everyone in the family, including your mother, justifies it somehow or excuses it. The shock and confusion you'd feel is similar to how we feel, especially when we realize how the people we know and love are completely under the spell of religion. They defend the indefensible. It's as if they're not the same people we used to know. And that makes us feel different, distant, and isolated. Nothing makes sense anymore. Human rights violations are justifiable in some contexts. Logic takes a backseat to faith. Up is down and down is up. The sadness we feel is not always caused by the direct treatment we receive from believers. Sometimes those around us are nice, but they're still siding with hostile or belittling Islamic sentiments toward us. And sometimes it's that we lost our sense of purpose. If Islam was at the foundation of your reality, and it took up so much of your time, energy, and thought every single day, it's not that hard to see how it could still be on your mind, despite it being false. It feels like a betrayal against you. What do you do with all these verses that you memorized that are now stuck in your head? What about the habits that you formed? What about the things that you said and did, thinking that they were for a good reason? I empathize with every ex-Muslim who used to be a practicing Muslim. Not only do they have to mourn the loss of their reality, but they will be belittled and mocked by Muslims at every turn for not immediately dropping the topic. Why are you so obsessed with Islam? Islam lives in your head rent-free. In my case, I think about Islam often because I think about ex-Muslims often, and how we're openly berated with no consequence to the offender. I feel a moral responsibility and a burden, but the people asking aren't really interested in my answer. We ex-Muslims express our thoughts and feelings time and time again, only to be met with these cheap dawah zingers. ولكن لا حياة لمن تنادي. You know what? I take it back. I think the hostility from Islam and its followers is the biggest component of the suffering we go through. It's not just the treatment we get from some believers, it's the religious basis they have for their attitude and the complacency of their peers, and even onlookers who dismiss it all as religious freedom. It robs us of the space and opportunity to move on, and it actually draws some of us back in. Had they not been this unapologetically hostile towards us, had apostasy not resulted in physical and psychological abuse at their hands, I wouldn't be ala ad-Din today. I don't want to be ala ad-Din. I don't think I'm special or that I'm saying anything revolutionary. I'm just in a position where I can tolerate some risk in disguise to be able to do what apostates from other religions are openly able to do. I cannot wait for there to be more people like me so I don't have to feel like I'm one of the few speaking up. I want to put Islam behind me and tie up the loose ends, but I don't think my work here is done. And as long as I'm not stretching myself thin, I'll be around. The point is, though, everything I'll mention about existentialism is experienced by apostates from other religions, our situation as ex-Muslims is unique. A large portion of us are held back in the transitional phases because of the hostile social and religious environments we're subjected to, even in secular countries, and how the world seems to turn a blind eye to it because they don't want to be accused of Islamophobia. That doesn't help at all. Anyway, back to it. Speaking from experience, the ultimate purpose of a good Muslim is to worship Allah and do everything they can to avoid hell and attain heaven. They could still have other worldly goals, but they don't matter in the big picture. Every time I visited the Kaaba, I was reminded of the futility of my life outside of that place. Being in its presence amplified my belief in the afterlife and evoked a sense of fear in me. In those moments, I reminded myself that nothing matters as much as Islam. Not my school, my friends, the car I'm dreaming about, how well I played soccer last week, nothing. I should be sacrificing more of that and investing more into my afterlife. I'm sure a lot of Muslims and ex-Muslims know exactly how I felt. And then fast forward to today. I realized that I was not in a holy place. And though my emotions were real, they were not at all inspired by something supernatural or divine. I think about how that magnificent house of God that had me in awe was a man-made building that was destroyed multiple times. I was walking in the same place where people were held hostage and killed not that long ago. Was anything I experienced real? Was the temporary relief I felt from prayer inherently good, or was it only an illusion? All that fear and guilt that I suffered, was it all for nothing? And I realized that there likely is no afterlife, at least not in the Islamic description. Then why live at all? Why should I work hard and endure suffering, especially if I'm stuck in a difficult situation, and then just die? I used to think of this life as an investment for the next one. Say this dua, get a palm tree in Jannah. Pray this prayer, get a bigger mansion in Jannah. It's all very hedonistic and materialistic, but avoiding hell was a huge motivator. And the assurance that I can have whatever I want forever is a lot more appealing than a life of suffering, and that's it. If you feel this way and still don't return to Islam, give yourself a pat on the back. Believe it or not, I think that should put your mind at ease about your apostasy, because it's confirmation that you truly cannot believe in Islam. You see no choice in this moment but to experience the suffering because you know you cannot lie to yourself and pretend to believe. It's not how it works. For a religion to give meaning to your life and shield you from existentialism, you have to truly believe it, not only follow the rituals. So think of the glass as half full. You know because of your suffering that your beliefs, or lack thereof, are genuine. You know that what Islam and Muslims say about you being a self-denying believer isn't true. It's infinitely more likely that it's yet another control mechanism to make you doubt yourself and trust the doctrine instead. And this realization of your sincerity is how you start to turn this confusion into reassurance. Don't mistake an existential crisis for weakness. You're not feeling this way because you're mentally weak or spiritually deficient, as some believers would put it. You probably feel this way because you lost a huge part of your reality and because you're introspective. I admit it's a blessing and a curse. It's a lot more difficult to be so painfully aware of the absurdity of existence than to be thoughtlessly and blindly taking a huge leap of faith and following a set of beliefs. In his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, the French-Algerian philosopher Albert Camus calls this leap of faith philosophical suicide. He believes that there is no meaning to existence that transcends all of us. In other words, there is no objective meaning. Life is essentially meaningless. The universe may not care about us, and our attempts to find definitive meaning in this meaningless world is the absurd. But acknowledging the absurdity of life and revolting against it gives us room and opportunity to thrive and find our own meaning. This is just one way to think about it. You already exist, and you'll never find out why all humans exist if there's a reason at all. Why should that hold you back from finding what resonates with you? Maybe you shouldn't be searching outward for a purpose in the sky, but instead searching inwards for a purpose that fits you. I'm not saying that every believer lacks introspection and hadn't thought of justifications for their religion, but I have to admit, the majority of humans, including believers, are committing philosophical suicide by using a leap of faith to reject absurdity. Of course, ex-Muslims are more likely to go through existential crises. Those are triggered by the involuntary loss of faith we went through. Though it could be the case that a lot of Muslims are actually going through existential crises as well, they're less likely to admit it or vocalize it because they're taught to resolve it with faith. They might feel ashamed and guilty if that doesn't work. Many of us ex-Muslims have this projected onto us by believers. For example, I was talking to a Muslim TikToker with a gigantic following of young, impressionable, future bullies. He kept shouting at me and insisting that my life has no meaning without Islam, even though I gave him my answer. I am lucky to be resilient at this point in my life, but this berating can cause others a lot of harm. Looking back at it, I don't think he was intentionally misrepresenting my position. He simply couldn't fathom a world where the definition of a kafir is false, because that would shatter his whole reality. Welcome to the club. And rather than facing this dilemma head on, he lashes out in confusion and anger. Though it's helpful to understand his motivations, it doesn't absolve him from the harm he causes. I cannot control his behavior, but I can demonstrate resilience and hope that others get inspired to find their own path. One other book I found insightful is Man's Search for Meaning by Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist Viktor Frankl. He's a survivor of the concentration camps of World War II. He wrote about what gave the prisoners meaning and hope, among other things. It surprised me to realize that we humans adapt to our situation and always perceive suffering. A person is like a vacuum, and suffering is like gas. No matter how much or how little there is, it will fill her up. But the author believes that our attitude towards suffering is one of the ways to derive the meaning of life. And the meaning of life is dynamic. It not only varies for each person, but for each circumstance. You may not find an answer that applies for you till the day you die, and that's okay. It just means that your purpose is more adaptable. Say you're a prisoner serving a sentence for a crime you didn't commit. If you saw life as a religious test and the afterlife as a reward, you would waste your days in a prison cell praying and worshiping, hoping that you'd either be freed or be compensated in heaven. But you have no guarantee that the afterlife is real. So if you decide that your purpose in life is to study law and exonerate yourself, isn't that more productive? And once you're out of prison, you can find a new purpose, such as helping others who are in your shoes. That's one example of how having a dynamic approach to the meaning of life is a great advantage. The author says that one of the ways to find meaning is by creating work or doing a deed. In the example I just gave, the ex-prisoner is creating work that he is passionate about and doing a deed that makes sense of the suffering that he went through. I kid you not, but before preparing for this podcast, I had not thought of myself as that ex-prisoner, but I'm seeing it now. I mean, I say that I consider the meaning of life to be maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering, and I knew that helping others gave me purpose and contributed to my happiness. But before January 28th of 2022, I didn't notice how this was my way of utilizing my suffering to create meaning. This was my way of making sense of my suffering. And now I'm telling everybody. Not sure how I feel about that. I guess this is my 13th reason why to live. To quote Viktor Frankl quoting Friedrich Nietzsche, one who has a why to live for can endure almost any how. I have to agree with that. Having one purpose or more will help you bear your suffering. But it doesn't always have to be that deep. If you're not sure why you live, but you're not bothered by it, keep doing what you're doing. Not everyone falls into existential dread, and not everyone struggles to get out of it. Your mileage may vary. Anyway, Viktor Frankl also mentions how feeling shame for being unhappy exacerbates unhappiness. It makes it worse. You need to resist that shameful feeling. If it is imposed on you by believers, it is easier to dismiss when you realize that they're lashing out in a predictable and repetitive way. It's no coincidence that many of them repeat the same hurtful things towards us. Not only do they get them from the same religious influencers, but it's stemming from the same attachment to the meaning of life they're forced to share. Once you realize that it's not really about you, and it's stemming from Islam, it becomes monotone and easier to tune out. There is, however, a self-imposed component of shame and guilt. I cannot tell you definitively how you can quiet it down, or how you can handle all of the struggles we face. For many people, therapy helps a lot. There's no shame in that. And with or without therapy, your new worldview comes with time, introspection, and learning. You could learn through books about philosophy, but that's not the only way. Don't think that just because I name dropped a couple of books that I'm an academic, but so what? Academic credentials are often a gatekeeping mechanism. We give too much credit to anyone with a degree to do the thinking and speaking for us. That applies to Islam in general, to philosophy, and to many other disciplines. I'm hoping to publish a video soon where I demonstrate how Muhammad Hijab's article, for example, on free will, boils down to a couple of sentences that are easy to miss if you're intimidated by his credentials and his use of the English language. Whether reading into philosophy is feasible for you or not, you can listen to others giving their answers about the meaning of life and mix and match what you find to be reasonable. You could engage in discussions about these topics if it is safe to do so, or listen to those discussions with the intent to learn. And I hope to bring these conversations to people without the intimidation of hostile debates in overly complicated terms. It bothers me a lot when a religious apologist says, "This topic is very complicated and it takes years of studying to understand," when it's usually an evasive maneuver to avoid giving you the summarized version. Let's bring these discussions to the masses. You'd be surprised at how much your thoughts and conclusions end up matching those of a philosopher you haven't even read about. Don't underestimate yourself. We shouldn't stop at naming and shaming believers with harmful attitudes towards us. We need to accept our responsibility to ourselves and humanity to find purpose and fulfillment. I say we, but as ex-Muslims, we don't have to seek a collective purpose. Each and every one of us must find their own. This we becomes relevant when talking about finding a community, but that's a topic for another day. I wanted to talk about the other struggles, but I think this is enough rambling for now. Perhaps another time. Today, I shared my thoughts on the existential crisis many ex-Muslims experience, but of course, this is but one perspective and there's more to be said. Rather than giving you a summary, I'd like to get the summary from you. What did you learn today about my outlook on the topic? What are your agreements or disagreements? I'd like to know your thoughts. If you send me a message or write a comment, I will do my best to read it even if I cannot respond. Thank you for listening. This episode is sponsored by Existential Angst. Existential Angst, because I'll only stop thinking when I'm dead. Just kidding. As always, think critically and think for yourself.